50 years ago today, on May 20th, 1963, civil rights activist Medgar Evers finally got his break on local television in Jackson, Mississippi. After months of pleading for coverage of the civil rights movement in Mississippi, Evers was granted a single 17-minute-long interview on WLBT TV. Our guest, veteran television journalist Randall Pinkston, was there on that historic day in Mississippi. Randall, so good to see you. Thanks for being with us. Set the scene. Take us back to that day or that time in 1963. What had been going on and what led up to Medgar Evers finally getting this interview on WLBT?
Well, thank you, Debbie. Well, actually, his efforts had begun not months before, but years before, in the late 50s, as early as the Little Rock school desegregation situation, where President Eisenhower sent troops into Little Rock to desegregate the schools. Medgar Evers was watching local television. Back in those days, there were only two stations, the CBS affiliate WJTV and the NBC affiliate WLBT, only two stations. And on WLBT, what Medgar Evers saw was a bunch of white guys talking about interference from the federal government, outside agitators, and that this would never stand in Mississippi and that there was no need for it. And Medgar wanted to present his point of view, the point of view of African Americans and people of goodwill of all colors, that everybody had a right to constitutional rights, everybody was a taxpayer, and to give him the opportunity to appear on TV. So he wrote letters. He wrote letters to the station, he wrote letters to the FCC, and those letters were all rejected. His requests were rejected until 1963. By then, of course, the station was aware that there would be challenges to his license if, in fact, they did not acquiesce to some requests. And so Medgar finally got his opportunity to make a very eloquent speech. Among other things, he said that he was a military veteran, that he was a taxpayer, that he was a proud Mississippian, that he wanted to raise his family in the state where he was born, and that he only wanted what fair-minded people everywhere would want, an opportunity to be heard, an opportunity to enjoy the liberties promised in the U.S. Constitution. He made that speech, as you indicated, 50 years ago today on WLBT.
And when he made this speech, the station there was really between a rock and a hard place, weren't they, Randall? They first had the pressure of the community who did not want to cover the civil rights movement, did not want to see a black man on television, but then also the pressure placed on them for their license to be revoked if they did not allow him to come on. Tell me how much was at stake with that appearance.
Well, indeed there was pressure, but only pressure from some segments of the white community, certainly no pressure from the African American community not to do the broadcast. But the owners of the station did indeed believe that they would be targeted by people who didn't want black people to have equal rights. As you know, this is the early 60s. You have the freedom rides, the church bombings, home bombings. People had been killed. The following year, in 1964, we'd have the disappearance of the 3 civil rights workers that garnered international attention. So all of these things were pressing in on the management. The management of Channel 3, in fact, boarded up the windows. They did not let Medgar Evers do his speech live. They had him come in the afternoon and tape it. And he went home and watched it at home with his wife that night. So yes, there were pressures, but there was also something else. The Federal Communications Act of 1934 said that in exchange for broadcast owners having the opportunity to sell commercials, they owed a duty to the public interest, convenience, and necessity of everybody in their viewing area. Most broadcasters took that to mean whites only, but in fact, African Americans were part of that viewing area too. That's what Medgar Evers knew. That's what he fought to obtain.
I know you've had an opportunity to speak with Medgar Evers' widow, Marley Evers. Tell me what her take is on that appearance and what effect it had on, if you will, Medgar's destiny.
Well, they had met in college, and they were both very smart, talented young people. Medgar, having come back from the war, was a bit older than Marley. She wanted to leave Mississippi. She wanted to take their college degrees that they had earned at Alcorn College in Lorman, Mississippi, and move west or move north, where opportunities would be better. Medgar, on the other hand, wanted to fight for the rights of African Americans in his home state. he often told her, Myrlie, I have no choice. This is what I have to do with my life. This is my destiny. She accepted it. She was afraid that being on TV would make him a bigger target, and it did. But she knew that that was his destiny, and that's what he had to do.
You know what, Randall, in full disclosure, you and I have known each other for quite some time, probably 15 going on 20 years. Our broadcast producer here, Dick Jeffers, says he's known you for 40 years, which makes both of y'all really old. But you have a personal connection to this story. You were at the station that day.
Yeah, well, I wasn't at the station the day that he made the speech. I was a teenager at home with everybody else, thrilled to see Medgar Evers on TV, having seen so many other instances where the signal went to black when a black civil rights worker appeared on local television. My connection came years later. After Medgar's death, the Reverend Everett Park of the United Church of Christ Office of Communications selected Channel 3 to be a test case to challenge the license. He was eventually successful, and because of that lawsuit, it opened the doors for minorities in Mississippi and ultimately around the country to gain a foothold in broadcasting. And I was one of, not the first, but among the first to be hired at this station where Medgar made that speech. In the same studio where he made the speech, that's where I began my career in broadcast journalism.
Isn't that amazing? And what a change you've seen over the course of your career.
Absolutely. That station became a leader in diversity, not only in Mississippi, but around the country. I went from weekend news to 10 p.m. news, eventually to the main newscast in that market, the 6 p.m. newscast. The viewers there, who in those days kept track of what they viewed with a diary. They would write down what they watched. I was told later that my newscast had the highest rating of any newscast ever. The station had always been #1, but by the time I got around to doing the 6 o'clock newscast, the viewers accepted me as someone who could present the news and someone that they wanted to listen to. And by the way, those diaries were not in the homes of African Americans. So Mississippi was out front and a leader 40 years ago. And from that day to this one, there has been either an African-American male or female co-anchoring their main newscasts. The sales manager there is African-American, program managers in the past, general managers. At one point, there was a majority black group that owned the station. That it's changed hands several times since then. But Channel 3 continues to make news and to be a leader when it comes to diversity and quality broadcasting.
Indeed. Randall Pinkston, thank you so much for coming on, sharing this story, and sharing your part in the story as well. Congratulations, my friend.
Thank you.
Take care.